humility is the focus of our first reading and our gospel today. That virtue of humility that I know I need it more, right? It's a virtue we sorely need in the world today. It's the antidote for the poison of that entitlement mentality that afflicts much of our society. And what keeps the world in strife and division is the spirit of me above others, instead of Jesus' spirit of offering myself in sacrificial love for others, right? And so in today's gospel, Jesus offers this virtue of humility as the cure for the self-absorbed narcissism that keeps people from truly loving the people around them, that incapacitates them to love those around them. And to encourage us in this virtue of humility, what I want to propose to you today is that this virtue of humility is tied to two things we value very much. Number one, our freedom, and number two, our happiness, right? And so if you're wondering what on earth does the virtue of humility have to do with our freedom and our happiness, good, because that's what we're going to dive into now. And first of all, what does humility have to do with freedom, with us having freedom? Well, when people are obsessed with themselves, caved in on themselves, they become enslaved to themselves. Right? If you've seen the movie The Hobbit, do you remember the character named Alfred? He was the deputy of the master of Lake Town. And he's named in the movie, but in the book it's simply like an unnamed counselor. Anyway, Alfred was so selfish, so self-absorbed, that he couldn't think about anything or anyone but himself, right? He couldn't give of himself in service to his fellow townspeople, especially as a civil servant. That's what you're supposed to do, right? That obsession with himself and his own interests, that's not freedom. That obsession is slavery. Why? Because we, as human persons, were made to be in relationship with others, to love others and to be loved by them. So lacking in humility and poisoned by this inordinate pride and vainglory, Alfred ruined his capacity to be in healthy relationship with others. And that kept him trapped all alone in the puny world of me, myself, and I. And also kept him from being part of the grander story of the salvation of the people of Lake Town and being part of the grander story of the salvation of all Middle Earth, right? So to us, if we lack humility and we suffer from the vice of inordinate pride and vainglory, we are kept confined in the puny little world of me, myself, and I, and kept from being part of the grander story, the grander true story of Jesus' rescue mission of the salvation of humanity, to which all of us are called to participate. Conversely, the virtue of humility frees us from our slavery to self and opens us up to be in service of others, to truly give of ourselves in love. And so that leads us to how having the virtue of humility is related to another thing we value very much, and that's our happiness. Right? It's in the giving ourselves away in loving service, that we find true fulfillment and the most profound kind of happiness, that is joy and beatitude. Because remember, there are different levels of happiness that vary widely, not only in degree, but in kind. And this is what our one-day presentation on the 4 levels of happiness that many of you are attending on September 17th will cover in much greater depth. But in summary, a little teaser for that. There are 4 levels of happiness. And the first and most basic happiness I like to call ice cream happiness, right? Because it's all about the happy feeling that we get when we eat ice cream or pizza or any sensual pleasure by which we get immediate gratification. Ice cream, you scream. We all scream for ice cream, right? I mean, Father Brian, I know, loves, it's like one of his favorite foods of all time. So ice cream makes us happy, but it is the most fleeting of all happinesses, right? The happiness is very temporary because the next thing you know, you want more ice cream the next day, if not the next hour, right? Or how about chips and salsa? We were just at a Mexican restaurant, that new one on Brooklyn, where we were just mowing down on the chips. We just couldn't get enough, right? And next thing you know, waiter, can we have another serving of chips? So this ice cream level of happiness that we get from physical or external stimuli, it's a very base level of happiness. A second level of happiness that's a little more advanced than the base level is ego-driven, right? It's the kind of happiness we get from personal success. I call it Tiger Woods happiness because, I've won this many tournaments and this many majors, and look how fit I am, and I've achieved this in my life, and I've achieved all that in my life. It's personal ambition happiness that gives you a sense of success. It gives you a sense of progress, about bettering yourself. Investing in our physical prowess, for example, or mental acuity, whatever it might be, right? It's a kind of a way for the whole reason why the self-help movement is so big, right? Because it gives us a sense of personal success. And a kind of pseudo version of these lower levels of happiness is the likes that we get in social media, right? We get this little ego boost and a dopamine hit that can be very addictive if we're not careful, right? So the challenge with these first two levels of happiness is that they're still ego-centered, right? It's about me, myself, and I. If we keep our notions of happiness limited to these two types of happiness, we'll never reach the type of profound happiness of joy and beatitude for which you and I were created to have. And you know what that limited notion of happiness leads to? Addiction, the addictive mentality. Because we think we can't see it beyond that kind of happiness. We're like, well, why am I not happy? I guess I just need more ice cream or more personal success, more of these things on my wall, right? Instead of realizing that I'm not just made for these base levels of happiness, I'm made for something greater. I'm made for something much more. And so if as a society we stay at these two levels of happiness, we'll continue to have a world of addiction, selfishness, narcissism, and the abdication of our responsibilities as a husband or a wife, or as a mother or father, as a priest, as a team member at work, whatever vocation you might be called. And life will be more about mano against mano as opposed to a collective effort for the common good, right? That's why there's, so many rich people who are not of want of any material things whatsoever, but they're utterly unhappy and depressed because they thought the accumulation of these things would make them happy. But as Gaudium et Spes reminds us, man, quote, man cannot fully find himself except for a sincere gift of himself, right? Man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. You can't discover and fulfill your deepest identity unless you've given yourself away in love, in selfless love. And so that's why we're called to this third level of happiness that is more contributive and other focused, which entails the invest of oneself and the giving of oneself for the betterment of others. I like to call it St. Mother Teresa happiness, right? It's not a kind of happiness that we get immediately. We have to work at it. But it's a kind of happiness that is much more perduring, much more rewarding in the long run. It's the kind of happiness that we can get when, like, someone who's so ego-driven, like a young man that's very ego-driven, all of a sudden becomes a father, and the whole world changes. His set of values and what he thinks is important all of a sudden changes, and he's called outside of his own selfishness. He's called outside of himself because he sees a good and a happiness in the sacrifice of himself for this little one, right? That's why fatherhood is such a huge maturing mechanism, or parenthood in general, right? And so when in humility, we can live our lives as a sincere gift of ourselves to God and to others, then, brothers and sisters, that's when we're truly free and truly happy. Which is why, ironically enough, the perfect image of freedom on this earth is that man nailed to a cross. That's freedom, right? Because he's not caved in and enslaved to himself, but is able to give of himself to others. Jesus was free of the selfishness that caves us in on ourselves. And ironically enough, then, the perfect image of happiness is likewise that crucifix, right? Because there he fulfilled the whole purpose of his earthly mission, of his earthly life, which was to make a sincere and total gift of himself, to sacrificially give himself away in love. Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, as Philippians says, but he emptied himself and took the form of a servant. Humility. And humility opened up the way to that higher level of happiness. For many of us, the desire to do that is in our hearts. We want to make a sincere gift of ourselves to God and to our loved ones and for the betterment of humanity and our community and all of creation. But we lack humility often, right? Our concupiscence, our selfish inclinations, our attachments to comfort and ease, and our addictions to worldly pleasures, those all keep us from knowing the freedom to be able to do what we aspire to, those higher levels of happiness. But the good news is that when we unite ourselves to him who has the power to do it, when we unite ourselves to Jesus, that cultivates in us the virtue of humility to overcome the obstacles, the attachments, the addictions. That's why the prayer life is so important, right? Because it's in prayer that we attach and surrender. When we surrender and dedicate our lives to Jesus and to becoming more like him, that virtue of humility is that we see on that cross is cultivated in each of us. His selflessness becomes more and more a part of us. His putting others before himself becomes manifest in our own lives. His capacity to lower himself so that others may be raised becomes a capacity in our own lives. Maybe you heard what happened to the famous Hollywood actor Shia LaBeouf. For those who don't know him, he's in a bunch of films, but especially known for his lead role for those first 3 Transformers movies. And I really liked his movie in 2019, The Peanut Butter Falcon. I think Father Brian and I saw that together. That was just before COVID hit, right? Anyway, after experiencing incredible worldly success with films that made a bundle in the box office, his life just became a total train wreck, right? He got into a lot of legal issues. He was caught plagiarizing films he was producing. He became an alcoholic and thus abusive, was charged with domestic abuse. And he was so ashamed of himself that at times he just wanted it all to end it all. But recently, he found himself involved in the making of a film on Padre Pio, that famous Franciscan mystic saint who had gotten the stigmata and the gift of prophetic knowledge. He could tell if you were withholding anything from confession, right? He passed away not even 60 years ago, so there's this film on him. And part of LaBeouf's preparation for the role entailed staying at a monastery and living the life from the inside. That experience brought him to his knees, and he encountered the Lord in a powerful way. And just this past week, especially through an interview with Bishop Barron, he announced he had become Catholic. But it took humility for LaBeouf to get there. You know, there's that saying, there's 2 kinds of people in the world: those who are humble and those who are about to be humbled, right? And Shia was the latter with all his worldly success. The good thing is that we don't need to go through to receive this grace of desperation, as some of people in the addiction community might say, because it's desperation was a grace because hitting rock bottom was the only thing that was going to make them look to God, to humble themselves enough, right? But the good thing is we don't need to go through all of that heartache in order to cultivate the virtue of humility in us. But that humility, to get that humility that leads to freedom and happiness, it does come at a price. Humility requires that we take the path of self-denial and renounce all the distractions in life, bad or good, to the extent that those activities get in the way of you growing in relationship with God and receiving the grace he wants us to receive. I mean, part of the reason, this is a primary way of receiving his grace here is disposing ourselves to receive him in the sacramental life of the church, right? Self-denial and sacrifice of even some of those good things in our life are essential in attaining these higher levels of happiness. I need to preach that to myself all the time, right? Finally, you may be wondering about the fourth level of happiness, because even the third level of happiness, as fulfilling as that may be, ultimately is not enough to make us completely happy, because we're made for something even more. As St. Augustine reminds us, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord. So even our most profound relationships that are good and loving are not enough, right? Sometimes in marriage prep, I'll tell couples, don't put that cross on your significant other. They're not meant to take that cross, right? So even our most profound relationships that are good and loving are not enough, because we're meant for a transcendent happiness that is in union with him who is goodness and love itself. I call it Blessed Mother happiness, because Our Lady was the first to experience that full splendor of the glory of God for which all of us are made. We strive for that happiness when we humble ourselves before God in worship, right? But that final level of happiness won't be complete until we're at the eternal wedding banquet, when Jesus, the bridegroom, will see the humility that you exhibited on this earth, and he will approach you and say to you at that definitive wedding feast, my friend, move up higher. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who exalts